Hello, I'm Maria Ressa. Welcome to Talk Thursday. Today we speak with climate change expert Christophe Crépin. He is the sector leader for environment and climate change in the East Asian Pacific region of the World Bank. On Tuesday, a World Bank report named the Philippines the third most vulnerable country to weather-related events in the world. Christophe Crépin joins us today to talk about climate change in the Philippines and what we can do about it. Welcome to Manila, Christophe.
Thank you and good afternoon, Maria.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. So it took you a year to do this report. What did you find?
Well, we were asked by the government to look at the budget, how much is actually being spent and how is it being spent on climate change. And importantly, how the policies that have been put in place within the past 3-4 years, which are focused on doing action on climate, how are those policies translating into budget and into action and into result? And that's really what we have been focusing on.
Some people aren't convinced there's a problem with climate change. Is there a problem?
Well, Maria, that's exactly the first question to ask. And this is why the first chapter of the review that we just completed is actually about climate science. If there's not a problem, why should we bother and what should we focus on using scarce domestic resources on these issues? Well, the fact is, this is an issue.
Yeah.
The issue is recognized. The science is unequivocal. The planet is warming.
Yes.
0.8 degrees since the pre-industrial time. Huge increases since 1970, and even worse, in the past 10 years. And this is translating into some physical impact in terms of sea level rise, in terms of intensification of storm, in terms of number of and extended heat waves. So there's a number of very important physical elements that are happening because of that changing climate.
I think even intuitively we're starting to feel that. The storms last year were going through different areas of the Philippines. Well, can you take them apart one by one? The sea level rise, what does that mean exactly, and what did you find in the Philippines?
Well, it means that people who live on the coast,
yeah.
And the Philippines is clearly a country where quite a few people are living on the coast.
7,100 islands.
Exactly, many islands. It means also that the poor and the most poor, of these people who are living in difficult conditions on the coast in urban areas, they actually are directly exposed to that sea level rise. What does that mean as well? It means that when you have a storm,
yes,
the impact of the storm is even worse because you've got some kind of combining effect and some addition of risk and impact of different factors. So at the end of the day, clearly the coast has become extremely vulnerable, and what is projected by science is that this is going to get worse as we move towards the end of this century.
Can climate change affect the path of storms?
Well, it's again, those are projections,
yes.
But indeed the past, the trajectory of storm seems to have been or will be influenced by an evolving climate. Yes.
So when you say that the Philippines is vulnerable on the rise of the rising sea levels, what does that mean for people? I mean, how will that impact the fishermen, the people who live on the coastlines?
Well, it's mean that one is that some of the assets,
yeah.
whether they are at community level or whether they are some bigger assets, that are part of the public, good that the government, is financing in terms of roads, in terms of bridges, in terms of a number of things that people use on a daily basis, those are going to be put at risk. Livelihood, people who are doing agriculture on the coast, people who are having some economic activity on the coast, tourism,
yes.
All this, will of course will be under pressure.
The next thing you talked about is the tropical cyclones, the storms themselves, and the heat waves. You mentioned those. How do those two things come together?
Well, basically those are stresses on the system, on the livelihood, on people that just add to each other. If you take at the again on urban livelihood and where people are under difficult conditions, of course, when you get an heat waves, it impacts those people more than people who are well off, in nice apartment with aircon.
So what can be done now from the study that you did?
Well, I think what is important for the Philippines is to translate into action the framework, basically the priorities that the government has defined in terms of what should be done to address climate change.
Right.
So one of the priority of the government is actually to focus on adaptation, increasing the climate resilience of the economy, of people, of the society, of livelihood, and that's the priority number one.
Yes.
As you know, in climate change, there's two dimensions. One is reducing emission, and what we call greenhouse
gas emissions. When I hear that in the Philippines, Filipinos say, well, it's not our fault. We're not the ones who are spewing out greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, normally it's like a shifting of the blame most of the time to the United States. Did you run into this while you were doing the study?
Well, it's clear that when you look at the sources of emission worldwide, they're basically focused on 5-6 major economies.
Yes.
And that's well known, and I think that people in the Philippines know it as people elsewhere. What I think is important here is, one, that the country is engaged at international level, so that the dialogue takes place, so
yes.
that there's a discussion on how do we address that issue.
Yes.
That's a global problem, and it requires some global dialogue and some discussion among countries. That's one thing. The second is, as the economy develops here, as the energy consumption increase, as transport become more carbon intensive, that the Philippines also contribute to a lower,
yes.
greener economy. So that's going to be, and that is part of the government priorities also moving forward.
Do we emit enough? I mean, one of the results that you showed was that we're still in the top 25% in terms of developing nations and emitting greenhouse gas emissions. Is that something we need to worry about? Can something be done about that?
Well, as I was saying, I think that looking forward, it's clearly part of the planning, of the vision, the strategic, priorities of the government to promote some lower carbon, greener technology, consumption habits, and overall development approaches.
How do you deal with issues like that? Because I've heard Filipinos say, why should it matter whether we cut our own emission if the Western world doesn't cut their own emissions? How do you deal with issues like that in climate change when it's really finger pointing at blaming each other for?
Well, I think there's a international forum and framework for this discussion to take place under the UNFCCC, the UN Convention to Combat Climate Change.
Yes.
And so those discussions are taking place there, and I think that's the process. And it's going to continue, and I think they're making progress. I think it's important for all of us and for an institution like the World Bank is to focus on what can be done. And
Perfect.
I think that what's important here, and this is what we put as a priority, is one, where it matters and where there is willingness to act, we are working with countries to lower emission and do whatever it's possible to act now and prepare for the future. The second thing that we're doing is work on the adaptive capacity, basically what cannot be avoided,
yes.
what it is going to happen that needs to be addressed. And that's basically our second priority, of course, at the World Bank.
That seems to be connected, right, to every year we have typhoon season, and that seems to be directly connected to disaster risk reduction. Is that connected to it, or are you looking at these as two separate problems?
Well, that's one of the points which is developed in the study, which is that over the past few years, there's been a number of policy evolution, policy reform that have been undertaken by the government, and one of them is the kind of paradigm shift on disaster risk management from a focus mainly on recovery and rehabilitation to a focus also on risk prevention. And there's clearly a lot of synergy and joint effort that are taking place in the context of adapting to climate change.
Interesting. The other thing the report also pointed out is that there's a window of opportunity for Filipinos to actually do something. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think one of the message also which I guess is not quite new, but is stressed here in the context of looking at the budget of this year, of next year, not the budget in 30 years, is, well, although things are going to change progressively and the main impact, we're seen by 2050, 60, 70, and 80, it's important to act now. One, because some impact already felt now, and people see it, and people ask for action now.
Correct.
The second is that there's a number of decisions in a country that grow at 7, 6, 7, 8% per year. A number of decisions are taken now that are going to impact the way the situation is going to be handled tomorrow.
And can help mitigate.
And therefore, it's important to act now.
In terms of, well, look, this is a perfect example. We just had a question come in from Mami Bola Siapao on Twitter. Should the rich nations compensate the poor nations for messing up the planet? I mean, again, going back to the earlier
that's the same.
Conversation.
That's indeed a discussion that has been going on for some time. It will continue to go on. That's part of the global dialogue and how countries interact. I think that we're getting closer to some common understanding as we move forward.
Yes.
Again, there's a framework for that to happen. That's the UNFCCC, and I think that we need to let that process go. Meanwhile, important to act when we can, where we can, and where there is willingness to make a difference.
What actions did you recommend in this report?
So, in this report, the focus has been on looking at the progress that has been made in the past few years on policy, institution, and financing. Sorry for the jargon, but basically how a government works, it's about finance, policy, and institution, and how much and how well the budget is aligned against the priority on climate change, so that we move from planning to execution and monitoring and reporting. And that's where the concept of accountability in terms of whether action is being taken is being looked at.
So you're really looking at what the government can do. What about the people themselves? Is there anything that they can do now? Because they're living through it.
Exactly. And so I think here there's two aspects. One is that we actually had the government to commission an opinion survey that was done in March, April. It was looking at the awareness, the understanding of the Filipino on climate change.
Exactly.
And one of the questions, what are you doing about it?
Right.
And clearly you see that there's still some disconnect between some perception of issues and what is being done.
Right.
And so that means that in terms of the awareness, in terms of the dialogue, what we're doing today,
yes,
this is important to continue so that everyone can contribute. At the end of the day, the solution is going to be a partnership, is going to be about everyone contributing to address the issue.
Which actually leads us to a question from @McCrae Economics. Mr. Crepin, how do collaborative efforts from government and private sector address climate change?
Well, first, there's always this discussion that can take place in terms of how much government and private sector work together.
Yes.
I think what it boils down to at the end of the day is, one, whether there's a common understanding of the problem, perception of the problem. And I think there was an opinion survey a few years ago here in the Philippines.
Yes.
I remember that, which I think is mentioned in the report, 79% of the business community, people involved in business community here in the Philippines were actually concerned by climate change.
79%.
Yeah, that was done a few years ago, and so I think we mentioned that. So first is a common assessment of the issue, and second is creating the right condition for this to happen.
During the opinion survey that you talked about, though, what is the understanding of the common man, the majority of Filipinos? What is their understanding of climate change? Did you get a sense of that?
Well, there's a high percentage of the respondent that clearly said that yes, they were concerned by climate change.
That's interesting. 79% of businesses concerned about climate change. We don't see a lot of it on media. I mean, certainly not enough. And even in terms of political debates and actions, very few legislators actually talk about it yet, so far. Recommendations. What other recommendations did you give then?
Well, the recommendation is that the adapting to climate change, if you look at the impact side of it, but even the moving to a lower carbon economy, a greener economy, is not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a transformation process next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And so that's going to take time. What's important is that there is a demand for change. And so one of the recommendations of the report here is for the government working with others to continue to support the understanding and the involvement of civil society and others in the discussion on climate change, so that the demand for reform, for evolution, for transformation is sustained.
Essentially, you're saying we have to bring the population, we have to get the information out to the public, and then bring it back to the institutions through the people. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, I guess it's for climate change, it's for any transformation, reform process, is that there is no demand for it, or the demand is not expressed strongly, that is not going to happen.
Through policy. This type of political process takes a long time, but climate change unfolds at a pretty rapid pace. I mean, can you give me an idea of what it'll look like in the Philippines, say, in a decade? How alarmed should we be alarmed? Is it, if we don't take action, for example, what do we lose?
Well, the World Bank launched a report last week on the 4-degree world.
Yes.
And which is a scenario in terms of warming, which is different from what has been discussed so far, where the focus has been mostly on the 2-degree world. And so when we get back to the discussion we were having earlier in terms of sea level rise, in terms of intensification of storm, in terms of heat waves, in terms of acidification of the ocean, with implication on coral reef, and from coral reef on fisheries, and from fisheries on livelihood, and so forth and so on. So those are, the 4 or 5 key ticket items that are projected and assessed and discussed by the science.
If I remember this correctly, though, it was talking about a generation, though, right? For the difference, you talked about the difference between a 2-degree world and a 4-degree world. That 4-degree world, the difference of the 2 degrees, what timetable are you looking at if nothing is done?
Well, basically, what it means is that if we are on the path for a 4-degree world by the end of the century, 280, 90, it means that we would be at 2 degrees in 20, 30 years. That means that in our lifetime, we would see some significant impact. Things are going to accelerate. So that's what we're talking about. It's about our lifetime.
And in the Philippines, what would that look like?
Again, sea level rise, we're talking about, that would be 30 to 50 centimeters, of sea level rise, by 2040, I think.
So are we talking about some areas of the country underwater, or?
Well, clearly, a number of cities are particularly at risk. Manila is one of the most vulnerable and at risk. And
why? Are we below the water?
Yeah,
table?
that's
Yes. So and other cities, because again, the other thing that last year we had in Cagayan de Oro, we had a typhoon go through that area, and again there were parts of it that were engulfed in water, where people were living. Are you seeing in a 4-degree world?
Well, clearly the flood management is going to be an important and will continue to be an important area to invest in and to focus on in terms of public and private policy moving forward.
Your specific recommendations to the government, aside from getting this out to the population and getting them to understand the problem, having it go back. I mean, you're talking about institutions that move very slowly.
Well, I think that the government has put in place some fairly solid policies in terms of objective and priorities. Therefore, at this stage, the reviews is focusing on how to get that implemented. So it talks about prioritization. It talks about getting a common set of understanding of priorities within the government. So there was not the priorities from the Climate Change Commission, and then the priorities from the Department of Agriculture, and then the priorities from the LGUs, and at the end it doesn't add up. And from there, we use the budget, as efficiently as possible to support those priorities, but also to monitor the effectiveness of those actions.
The way it stands right now, these three things, the policy institution and the financing of it, are we on the right track?
Well, again, what the reviews says is that from a policy and institutional perspective, the reforms that have been done the past 3-4 years actually moving in the right direction.
Okay.
Which is that moving from a fairly fragmented type of approach to something comprehensive and coordinated with some a horizontal and vertical dialogue on climate change. Now it's about implementation.
Interesting. Well, talking about implementation, again, what we've seen in the last 2 years, I think 2011 is Sendong, but from these typhoons that we've had, we're reactive as a society, and we do see public and private sector come together for help after a typhoon or after a disaster. But how long do you see before it becomes preventive, where we get to a point where it can be preventive?
Well, that's exactly part of the dialogue that is taking place. That has to take place further as we move forward, and all that energy that indeed is being spent when a disaster of harmland occurs transform into a willingness to act in terms of prevention, in terms of increasing what we call the climate resilience, the ability to adapt and prevent some of the adapt to new condition and prevent some of the consequences.
What are the biggest stumbling blocks to get there?
Well, on the policy side, as I was mentioning earlier, we need to get some clear alignment between the national level, the sector level, the local level in terms of what needs to be done and where to put the priorities, and that's not quite there yet.
Yes, because the local level in the end will be implementing, correct?
Exactly. Then to reflect that in the budget process, to set in place a mechanism that allows to proactively allocate and budget on some of those priorities and be able to track, what is being done and therefore what result this activity brings. And so this is what exactly government has started to do in the context of this review, and is going to move forward, aligning the budget with the policy and the expected results.
The policy level occurs at a much higher level than ordinary Filipinos, 100 million Filipinos. For the people who are watching us now, if they're concerned about it, what can they do?
Well, first, I think it's important that the government at the various levels is supported, that this demand, for action, as mentioned earlier, is expressed. I think it's very important for any government in the world to, get that support and that backup, from everyone, that this is a priority that needs to be done. And second, it's a matter of changing also lifestyles and changing consumption patterns, changing land use planning, development, adjusting development priorities. Number of things that can be done by ordinary Filipino to adapt, but also avoid making things worse.
Mm-hmm. What will make things worse?
I think it's two things. Okay, one is of course on the carbon side, but as you said, The Philippines is not a major emitter, but
Indonesia is, by the way, though. The smog, the forest fires that are there were, at least in 1997, they were the largest carbon emitters, right?
Exactly.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but go ahead. So not to emit, to bring down carbon level emissions.
Exactly. Well, we were discussing earlier on this concept of locking of decisions that are taken now
Yes.
that are going to make things worse later. Well, I think this is one of the key elements to keep in mind. What is that is being done now in terms of how you use the land, how you build and where you build, in terms of the deforestation that might be induced, in terms of where you do where you develop your crops, in terms of a number of these things that are going to actually contribute to increase the stresses on the system and therefore the impact of the climate evolution.
Everything that you've mentioned, though, still requires government initiative because those are rules, laws that local government would implement. And we've had from the Ormoc in the early 90s when you had a flash flood that brought 10,000 people to their deaths. I mean, anyway, I guess you talked about pressuring the government and understanding what they can do about it, but yet it's also the government's responsibility to educate the people about this problem. It's a chicken or the egg question. Where do you see movement happening now?
Well, I think, as we said earlier, as part of partnerships, everyone has to work on this. I think movement is coming from different angles, and I don't think that we say, one is moving and the other one is not moving. Clearly, the government has made a lot of progress, in terms of changing policy, in terms of changing institution, in terms of allocating more budget. This is one of the messages that comes out of the review. The government has allocated more resources to activities that have some positive impact on some climate change-related issues. The second is that civil society is very active here.
Largest number of NGOs in the world, I'm told. Anyway.
So it's coming also from there. LGUs, was quite impressed to see how much some of the NGOs are actually not waiting for the government to issue a new law or give more subsidy or whatever. They're just doing it.
Yes, but I think we've learned our lessons from the last 2 years, because they're the ones, local governments are the ones who are at the forefront when climate change strikes, when the typhoons hit, when disaster strikes. But is it enough?
Well, it has to be part of the solution, and to some extent, for some, it has to start with that. Again, we get back to this discussion on whether there is a demand. And so when an LGU, is confronted with some of those impacts, it doesn't wait, for the government to say, well, this is important. They just see that it's important, and they're doing it.
Fantastic. Well, we're close. We're running out of time. I just want to ask you another question. Last question from McCray Economics. How strong is the impact of CC on the migration of people from disaster risk areas, and what policy should the government pursue?
Well, there's a lot of discussion on the relationship between climate change and migration, within countries and across countries. And clearly, in the Philippines, it's important. There's still quite an urbanization process, that's going on, and the way this urbanization is going to take place, so this internal migration, within the country, is going to be quite important in terms of the impact of tomorrow.
Are you seeing it now, though? Is there any direct impact of what's happening?
Well, it's clear that when in a city where you've got some concentration of housing and especially with a lot of poor in it, the impacts are quite disaster. The impact of disaster or sea level rise are of course quite meaningful compared to people in nice buildings with aircon.
Which again we saw in the end of 2011 and 2012 when the typhoon season hit. This country is also fighting endemic corruption. When you have a government that's still working to strengthen institutions, what role is this playing in the fight to fight climate change?
Well,
how much more difficult is it making it?
Well, I think that for whatever is being done with public institutions and public policies and public resources boils down to the effectiveness of what is being used. One of the core elements of the discussion in this review is how do we make all this more effective.
Correct.
Whatever the reason is behind, the objective is to make that more effective, transparent, and increase the accountability in terms of the results.
Fantastic. Any last words, Christophe? I mean, the report is out. It was out last week. Last thoughts, last words.
Well, just quick words. First, thank you for that, for this in the invitation today. But I think the main point here is that this is an agenda for the long term.
Yeah.
This report is not the end. This is the process. This is meant to help the government and others to move forward, to be more clear on what the issues are, and to propose, some advice, some recommendation on how they can be addressed. I think the government is taking it exactly that way, and we're now working with the government and others to get to the next step, which is implementing the recommendations.
Hope they implement soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria.
We've been speaking with climate change expert Christophe Crepin. He is the sector leader for environment and climate change in East Asia and the Pacific region of the World Bank. He's just finished a report that came out this week. Thank you for watching Talk Thursday. Please continue to send your questions. We'll get him on Twitter to respond to some of them. Do you have a Twitter account?
Yeah.
What's your Twitter account?
Well, I'll send you.
Okay,
afterwards.
we'll tweet it to you from @rappler.com. Thank you for joining us on Talk Thursday.
Thank you.
I'm sorry I kept